Today we are covering 5 separate Powerstancing DLC builds, meaning that we're only going to be playing with DLC weapons and going to be Powerstancing or dual wielding them. I'm not going to be including paired weapons, so things like hand-to-hand, backhand blades, Rolana's twin blades, the Falcons, stuff like that are not going to be on this list. I have made like separate videos on basically all of those weapons alongside my other build videos, so you can go check those out. Now also I do want to mention that a few of these builds are going to require you to go to New Game Plus, because some of these weapons you can only get 1 per playthrough and we're going to be using 2 of them. So you either have to go to New Game Plus or get somebody to drop it for you. But the reason I am making this Powerstancing video, because some weapon types are just better paired alongside another weapon because their Powerstancing combos are just better that way, or maybe certain types of weapon skills are just better paired alongside something else as well. And I am only going to try to cover like optimal types of builds. There's going to be lots of different Powerstancing builds out there. A lot of them I just do not care for. So if you do have your own questions as to why some of them are just not going to be on this list, you can just ask them down below and I can just give you my reasoning. But with that out the way, let's just get started. The SERPENT FLAIL had the potential to be like one of the best weapons in the entire game, but unfortunately it's a flail, so therefore it cannot be, because this weapon's skill, Flare O Serpent, for only 8 FP, buffs the weapon with plus 90 fire damage for 30 seconds, and when you have the weapon slam onto the ground, it actually does do an explosion of which does amazing damage, high amounts of stance damage, and send these smaller enemies flying. And to hit the weapon onto the ground, you have to use things like a jumping attack, running attack, or a heavy attack, which a heavy attack does make sense to be like the best option because you can just get so much damage out of your heavy attacks. But unfortunately, flail heavy attacks are terrible. They're like the slowest things in the world and they don't really do the damage to compensate for that. If this thing was like a hammer instead, it would just be like a top 10 weapon in this game. But unfortunately, we now have to go spec into a Powerstancing build, which is going to require us going into New Game Plus to get a second one. But the rewards and the benefits are really high because, as you can see, the damage output is really good. Now, unfortunately, when you actually have the weapon explode, it removes the buff, so you have to keep buffing over and over again, which is not going to be that expensive. It's only 8 FP, but it is very inconvenient to do it like multiple times in a boss fight. But this weapon is going to be doing a lot of fire damage, does get a very good faith scaling, and just like all flails, for some reason they get really high dexterity requirements, even though their movesets are like the exact same as hammers. But being that we're going into jumping attacks, obviously the Raptor Feathers chest piece or the Crow chest piece, alongside the Claw Talisman, these things are just going to boost it by 10% each. And this Explosion AoE actually is counted as a Mesmer Flame skill, so it actually does get boosted by the Shard of Alexander and the Winged Serpent Helm. So having both of these things on will actually result in high amounts of damage. And as you can see, this jumping attack not only does amazing damage, sends enemies flying, but it actually does upwards of 42 stance damage as well, which that's like just as much as like a colossal weapon power stance jumping attack. And it's going to have much quicker recovery frames, be a lot lighter, and it's a lot more forgiving. Also going to put on the Ritual Sword Talisman and the Fire Scorpion Charm, but if you see yourself taking a lot of damage, you can just switch these things off for some like damage negation talismans instead, or maybe the Flox Canvas Talisman to just boost the damage of your spells, which, speaking of which, once again, I always recommend just going into variety. For a single target option, I think Knight's Lightning Spear is the best. For those larger bosses, we can just go ahead and use Pest Thread Spears. And you also can use Scarlet Aeonia to just proc Scarlet Rot at the beginning of a boss fight, and that's just going to result in 30% damage over the next 90 seconds. And then obviously Golden Bow, Flame, Get Me Strength, and you can use a healing spell of your choosing as well. And as for the crystal tiers, we're going to have the Faith tier and the Fire tier. If you are at really high amounts of faith, like over 80 faith already, you don't really need the faith tier, of which you actually can use the oil tier instead. This one can be a nice replacement. It does only last 40 seconds, but as long as you're close to an enemy, it is going to boost your fire damage by about 30%. So if you were looking for the optimal way to build around the Serpent Flail, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to go into New Game Plus because Powerstancing is going to be the best way to do it. If you've ever used the Star Fist and you're having problems with connecting with the heavy attacks because they have really bad range, this is going to be your next best option because it can proc stance breaks almost just as fast, but it's going to do it at a much further range because yes, the Pata is a fist-based weapon that performs very similar to the Kata, that it does actually get the piercing and poking attack type of moveset, does get the 110 crit multiplier as well, but it is just going to do more damage and just have much more range than the Kata. Now, we're actually going to be Powerstancing 2 of them. Now, yes, I know you can just two-handed to do the Powerstancing combo, but we're going to have 2 separate ones, one in each hand, which does sound silly, but there is a method behind this, so hear me out. Because when you have the weapon two-handed and do the heavy attack, it does a nice little 1-2 punch, which does do some nice damage, but unfortunately, it only does 15 stance damage, which compared to all other fist weapons, that is not good. But when you have it one-handed and do the heavy attack, it performs the same way as all the other fist weapons, and that's going to be doing 30 stance damage really quickly. So yes, the one-handed heavy attack is much faster and does twice as much stance damage as the two-handed heavy attack. Don't know why that is. It might be a bug. The guitar works the exact same way, so it's really always been like that. But being that that's the case, we're going to play around it by just putting a second guitar in our left hand. Now, yes, this is going to require New Game Plus. You could just use the guitar in your left hand or any other fist weapon, but you're not going to really utilize that longer reach. But this way you actually can do the really quick one-handed charged heavy attacks and actually use the left bumper or the L1 button to actually utilize the Powerstancing combos. Which the Powerstancing light attacks, they're really quick. They're obviously going to hit at nice distances. They're going to be doing piercing damage, which obviously is really good. But the main attacking option is going to be that heavy attack, because 30 stance damage for every single swing is really good. And you can put Crackblade onto this thing and it's going to be doing 33 stance damage, which is just as much as the Star Fist. So this thing can stance break just as quick as that, and it's going to do it at a much further distance too. Now the damage difference is obviously going to be somewhat significant, but this thing actually is doing piercing damage. So when you pair it alongside this Spear Talisman, it actually might be a lot closer than you think. Now, being that we are going to go spec into a charged heavy attack build, obviously that means we're going to have the Axe Talisman and the Spiked Cracked tier. And if we're stance breaking really quick, we might as well throw on the Dagger Talisman and the Blade of Mercy. That's just going to result in a lot more critical damage and more damage after the critical attack too. You can also put on the Thorny Cracked tier, which can be up to 20% more damage with successive attacks. And with how quick the fist light attack combos are, you can just go lead off the fight with those, just hit a few times, proc the buff, and then spam your heavy attacks. Now, being that we do have two separate weapons, we might as well utilize two separate skills. Obviously, the first one being Crackblade, and on our offhand, we are going to have Beast Roar. This is actually going to be a pretty decent projectile skill that does scale purely off dexterity, and we are going to spec into a lot of dexterity with this build, so it's going to make for a nice pairing. Now, Stormblade is going to just do more damage, but you can't put Stormblade onto a fist weapon, so this is going to be the next best option, and actually does go further than Stormblade, so it's not going to be that much worse. But obviously, projectile options are like a must-have in almost every single build. That is help out in so many different areas and in dealing with multiple enemies at once. But this build is incredibly powerful. You can stance break incredibly quickly at a decent distance, do high amounts of critical damage because your weapon is doing 110 crit alongside all the talismans that we have, and you get a nice projectile option too. The BLACKSTEEL TWINBLADE is the highest damaging twin blade in the game. It also does get some of the most range, and when building around twin blades, for the most part, they're just going to be outclassed by other weapons, except for when it comes to the Powerstancing jumping attacks. This is probably like the best attack in the entire game. So we are going to go spec into a Holy and Faith-based build, because with the BLACKSTEEL weapons, this is just going to be the optimal path to just get really high damage. Now, very popular pairings alongside these Power Stance jumping attack builds will be with things like Bleed, and Bleed is obviously going to be really good, and you could just output just more damage in some cases with a Bleed type of build, and you could probably just melt bosses even quicker, especially if you are at those like later New Game Plus iterations. But having a non-status effect jumping attack build can just be just as good. As you can see, like the damage output is still incredible, and when you do go up against those enemies that are like really resist to bleed or immune to bleed, you're not really going to be experiencing a fall off in your DPS. And when going with status effect builds, you do have to try and keep up your aggression, otherwise the bleed meter will actually reset. Whereas with a build like this, you don't really have to worry about being aggressive. You can be a bit more passive and just focus on dodging. So although it's not going to be the most optimal in terms of DPS, there are going to be some benefits that just regular damaging based jumping attack builds have over the status effect versions. But the reason why the BLACKSTEEL TWINBLADE does get really high AR, because it does come with split holy damage, a faith scaling, and it can be infused. So when you pair it alongside a sacred infusion, it kind of like doubles down into that faith stat, gives you really high amounts of AR, and it also does get the unique benefit of when you actually boost it with a holy type of buff, it kind of just like doubles the effect and just gives you like twice as much damage out of that buff. And Sacred Blade Ash of War is going to be one of them. We're going to have Sacred Blade infused onto both of them, and with every single buff, it's just going to boost our damage by like over 200 AR. So obviously when going into these twin blade builds, going to utilize the Claw Talisman alongside either the Raptor Feathers chest piece or the Crow chest piece. Obviously both of the multi-hit talismans. Can have some pieces of the Rakshasa set as well, because every single piece is going to be 2% damage. And the Sacred Scorpion Charm, which is 12% more holy damage, but it does make us take 10% more physical damage. So if you are noticing you're getting hit really hard, you can switch this talisman off for like a damage negation talisman instead. And in our crystal tier, we're going to have the Thorny Cracked tier, which with successive attacks is going to further boost our damage up to 20%, and the Holy tier for 15% more holy damage. And we're also going to have the Sword of Light in our back pocket, which is going to use its skill at the beginning of the boss fight, which is going to be 20% more holy damage for the next minute. And no, we don't have to actually damage anything with it at all. But being that we are speccing into a lot of faith, we might as well utilize some spells with the Erdtree seal. This is the best seal to have at over 69 faith. Knight's Lightning Spear is a good single target option, and then Pest Thread Spears for those larger bosses. And then obviously Golden Vow for more damage and damage negation. You can go with a healing type of spell, and you can put on Flame Grant Me Strength if you are going to utilize things like Catch Flame and Pest Thread Spears. When you fight those bosses that are really resist to holy damage, you should probably switch around some of your talismans and buffs to go more into a fire type of build. You could even like change the infusions of your weapon. You can make them flame art infused instead. You could put the flame spear Asheror onto them, and that could work too. It's part of the reason why holy builds are just not really that big of a deal, because you have access to faith, which faith gives you access to many different damage types. The Bonny's Butchering Knife is one of the more underrated weapons in this Elden Ring DLC. The weapon is actually a reskinned version of the Sacred Butchering Knife, in that it's a great axe that does give you 1% HP regen for every single hit. But this weapon actually does get the unique skill called Hone Blade, which is very similar to the Butchering Knife from Dark Souls 3, in that it's going to be a weapon buff that does add 5% more damage, and it actually doubles the healing effect. So for every single hit, it's going to give you 2% HP. So for this build, we're actually going to have 2 of these things, which is going to require New Game Plus or having somebody drop it for you. And for every single swing, we're basically getting 4% HP back. And the Great Axe movesets are not that slow either. There actually is going to be another unique effect of the Bonny Butchering Knife that actually might be a bug. Every single time that you actually hit with the weapon when it's not buffed, and then when you actually use the buff afterwards, it does give you the health back for what you would have gotten if the buff was active. So let's just say you hit with the weapon 20 times when it wasn't buffed, and then you go ahead and buff, it gives you 20% of your health back. And this is actually going to work with both weapons. So when hitting that 20 times, you can actually go ahead and use the skill for both weapons, and you're getting 40% of your health back. Now, the Bonny Butchering Knife is going to be a predominantly strength-based weapon. Does get a B scaling in strength and a D scaling in dexterity. So we're just going to meet the minimum requirements of dexterity and just put the rest of the points into strength. Obviously have 60 vigor as well. Now, being that we are playing into some health regen, we might also go throw on the Godskin Swaddling Cloth, because if we're just spamming the light attacks a whole bunch to try and get more health regen, this is just going to help us out. Because with these successive attacks, we're just getting more health, and you might as well throw in the other talismans to boost damage, like the Millicent Prosthesis and the Sword Insignia. As long as we're constant like light attack spamming, we're just getting more damage, more health back. And being that we're using large power sensing weapons, things like jumping attacks are going to be really good. So you might as well throw in the Crow Black Quill's chest piece alongside the Claw Talisman. Both of these things are going to be 10% more damage to your jumping attacks. We're going to have the rest of the pieces of the Rakshasa set as well, because every single piece is going to be 2% more damage to all of your sources. We are going to have Golden Vow infused onto a dagger. Just throw it into the offhand. Every single boss fight, we'll just use it at the beginning and then switch back to your main weapons. Now, for every single build, I always recommend speccing into 15 Faith, because it gives you access to Bestial Vitality, Flame Grant Me Strength, and some damage negation spells. Now, the damage negation spells and Flame Grant Me Strength are actually body buffs, so you actually can't stack them together, but you actually can stack them with Bestial Vitality, which is going to be a little bit of health regen. And then Flame Grant Me Strength is just going to give us more stamina regen and just 20% more damage. And being that you are going into a strength-based build, you might as well just throw in the Claw Mark Seal, and you could use some spells. Some cheap options that are pretty viable will be things like Catch Flame or Pest Threads. Catch Flame for those enemies weaker to fire damage, and then Pest Threads for those really large bosses. Now, as for the crystal tiers, we're going to go with the Thorny Cracked tier, which is just more damage on consecutive attacks. So basically it works the exact same way as the Millicent's Prosthesis, but it's actually going to give you more of a benefit, because it actually does boost the damage up to 20%, and it obviously will stack with those things too. And we're going to go ahead and put on the Blood Sucking Cracked tier. This is just 20% more damage for the next 3 minutes, but it actually does drain roughly 1% HP per second, depending on your health. But obviously we can just completely negate that health draining mechanic by just spamming light attacks. So yes, unfortunately this build does require to get a second Bonny Butchering Knife, but as you can see, the returns are very high. The Barbed Staff Spear is a new Holy Great Spear in this game. It does get an A scaling in Faith. In its weapon skill, Jory's Inquisition does shoot out a volley of these golden arcs for only 6 FP, but it is 6 FP per tick, so the longer you hold on to it, the more FP it would consume, and actually can melt through your entire FP bar. But the damage output, the range of the skill, and a little bit of tracking it gets does make it worth it. Actually does do a little bit of blood loss build up as well. That might just be a bug, because the weapon itself does get a bit of bleed, so maybe it just like added it onto like the projectiles. It's not going to proc bleed that quickly, but it is just going to be a nice way to just maintain some bleed damage at a distance. Now, Great Spears are a really good weapon class. They get nothing but poking attacks, which they can hit at further distances. They do some nice stance damage. Now, typically you do lack variety with a Great Spear moveset, but thankfully the Barbed Staff Spear does get the horizontal swiping heavy attack, which is good for hitting multiple enemies. And the Powerstancing Great Spear moveset is also incredible because the movesets hit simultaneously, which Powerstancing combos that hit at the same time are just always going to be better because it typically means faster animations. And this is especially true for the rolling attack that it does get. It's really quick and a lot faster than like the regular light attack that you get. And the rolling attack is identical to the crouching attack. So you can just spam crouching attacks the entire time and you might just like do more DPS than just spamming the light attacks. And in this DLC, there are going to be items that you can use to boost these crouching attacks. The Retaliatory Cross Tree and the Letter's Armor both boost the crouching attack damage by 10%. Letter's Armor also does boost running attacks too. You can also pair this alongside the rest of the Rakshasa armor set. Every single piece is going to be 2% more damage to all of your sources. And being that you are hitting with multiple weapons in quick succession, you can put on one of the multi-hit talismans. I went with the Millicent's Prosthesis. Now, in our offhands, we are going to have the Messmer's Soldier Spear. This is going to be the best Great Spear that can be infused in the game. It does actually beat out the Lance because in most infusions, it just does the most amount of damage. It also does get the better heavy attack too. But we are going to have this Sacred infused with Sacred Order Ash of War. Now, Sacred Order is actually a unique buff that boosts the weapon damage by 10%, and it actually does put the buff onto both hands. So both weapons are going to receive a 10% damage buff for the next 60 seconds. So it's always going to be a really nice offhand option when you are Powerstancing. And best of all yet, it actually does boost your spells. So if you just have your Seal in your main hand and use Sacred Order in your offhand, you're just going to get 10% more damage to your spells too. Which, speaking of which, being that we are going to go with a holy build, you want to have stuff for variety, because there are a lot of different bosses in this game that are very holy resist. So if you end up fighting those bosses, you can just put on things like Catch Flame or Pest Thread Spears, and then put on things like Flame Grant Me Strength, obviously Golden Vow, and then switch to the Fire tier and just melt the bosses that way. Because typically with our Holy base build, we're going to have the Faith and the Holy tier, and we are going to be using the Sword of Light. Now for this weapon, we're not going to use it to do damage at all. We're just going to use it for its skill, which for 30 FP just gives us a Holy damaging buff. It's just 20% more Holy damage for the next 60 seconds. And as for the rest of the talismans, going to have the Shard of Alexander for 15% more skill damage, and we're going to have the Sacred Scorpion Charm, which is going to be a bunch more holy damage, but it does make us take a bit more damage as well. So this one can be interchangeable. If you're noticing you're taking a lot of damage and you're dying really quickly, I'd switch this one out for like a damage negation talisman instead. Anyway, that is the video now done and completed. I do want to make another build video sometime soon. I have made like a bunch of like top 5 best builds, but there are some like really good ones that I've yet to cover still. I know when I still talk about like the transformations and make builds around those. I still haven't made a build around the Claws of Night, the Sword of Night, the Dancing Blade of Rana. There's like a bunch of really good weapons out there that I haven't really touched on. I've talked about them in ranking videos, but I haven't really made a build around them. So if you do want to see that, definitely do like and subscribe, and also do follow me on Twitch because I'm live there every day doing a bunch of challenge runs and doing a bunch of testing as well. So if you are interested in that, give me a follow there too. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.